All right, and we're back, everyone. Sorry for that little momentary delay. We can all thank the internet overlords for that. But hey, I was just doing a tally. So after 115 live streams so far this year, that's our first glitch. That's the first time we've lost anything. So, it's kind of like the airports when you travel and they have the stats. You remember, Carl, when we used to travel all the time, like how often bags get lost based on people's travel. And Carl and I both, for a period, used to tour 150 to 200 days a year. And probably, back when we used to check luggage, probably once or twice a year, we'd lose our luggage. So people say, that sucks. Yeah, but in 200 flights, that's a very small percentage, to the airlines. That's like, you're winning. So
I can remember only one time, I think it was in Hong Kong, I had to present in my sweats because my bag just didn't show up. But that was out of like 3 years of presenting and oftentimes doing, 4 cities in 5 days. So I think we had a pretty good record there. And I gotta say, the setup that we have here and the fact that, I'm coming to you from hundreds of miles away. You've got this kind of central nervous system there in Arizona, and I'm managing to not only send one stream of video, but we're sending both the video and my screen simultaneously, so we can do these picture-in-picture effects. I'm pretty impressed with the technology that it does work as well as it does. So
right,
it's
for real,
pretty awesome.
Yeah. All right, so why don't we go ahead and kind of pick back up? Looks like everyone came back. Mostly everyone came back on Facebook. They'll be coming back. And I see we've got Stephanie Reed and Leon. What's up, my friend? Our friend from Amsterdam. I know. Very sorry we're not going to get to see you at IBC this year. Andrew Friedman and Ruben, Peter Paul, Richard. Good to see you again. Carlos, Mohammed Mozaga. Always lovely. And Karen Brisa coming to us over on YouTube as well. So, and we've got Desiree and a few more over on Twitter Periscope. So, Carl, we're talking about turnovers. Tell you what, why don't I go ahead and I'm gonna go to your picture and screen so you can kind of get right into it without wasting any time. And if you're ready, I'm gonna go send it over to you.
I'm ready.
All right.
All right.
Take it away.
Really quickly, once again, just talking about turnovers, a lot of this is just making sure that you're prepping your files because you're planning to go outside of Creative Cloud. You want to be able to take an edit that you're working on in Adobe Premiere and package that up in a way that you can toss it over the fence to somebody who's going to be mixing your film on a sound stage or is going to be using other applications. If you're coming from a YouTube background, and you work completely within Creative Cloud. Creative Cloud is incredibly powerful for giving you all the tools necessary to do all that finishing and to get a proper sound mix within Premiere or Adobe Audition, and be able to move pretty seamlessly between the different applications. When you move outside of Creative Cloud, we kind of rely on some standards that in some cases have been around for like 45 years. I don't think the EDL standard has really changed much since like 1978. But these are standard file formats that we use for taking the bulk of an edit and actually moving it over to other applications. So where I see people run into a lot of problems with this idea of turnovers is if you do come from sort of that self-contained world where you're delivering the final output for what's going to go online or what's going to go to a local TV station, and suddenly your budget increases, or a feature film project that you've been kind of working on the side suddenly gets distribution, and the studio says, hey, we want to invest $500,000 and give you a proper sound mix. Well, that's where if you plan for these things, the process can actually be pretty seamless and pretty straightforward. And we regularly have seen films edited in Premiere delivered to post houses like Skywalker Sound or to Technicolor for doing final finishing. So there are methods to doing it, but you do have to somewhat plan for it. The key to making all this happen, a lot of it has to do with making sure you have the right metadata in your files, that your edit stays organized. And this is the type of thing that you can either edit as you go and keep it organized as you go. If you have an assistant editor, that's oftentimes what an assistant does, is they'll kind of go in and take your edit where you're, painting with brush strokes and kind of getting, paint all over the canvas, as it were, kind of making sure that the dialogue tracks stay as dialogue and the music tracks stay as music tracks and so on. First thing I just want to point to, this is actually just a little, it's a little aside. It's one of my favorite little extra features to just make a note of. You'll notice that I've got my timeline here I've got the track heights are all minimized right now. We've got the minimum number of tracks available, or minimum track height available in the timeline. And you'll notice that you're seeing the names of the tracks. This is actually not the way Premiere works by default, but it's very easy to set up. You can set it up one time. And particularly when you're working with audio and you know you're going to be handing off your audio, keeping the tracks labeled and keeping those labels sort of front and center helps in this regard. So if I zoom out on these tracks, you'll see that I've got to zoom several steps before I start seeing things like my microphone, the sync lock toggle, mute, and solo, and so forth. The way to change this, if you haven't done this before, if you right-click in this track header area on the screen, you can choose to customize the track header. And the way this works, basically you drag from this area up here, the button editor, and drop it into whatever row you want to. So the name of the track is this little A1 icon here. All I have done, by default, Premiere puts that in the second row of the different buttons. And that second row is not visible when you minimize the track height. So all I've done here is just taken that and dragged it and dropped it into the top row. And I've actually moved everything else down so that when I'm minimized, where I'm just kind of quickly scrubbing through a timeline and looking at things, I don't want to accidentally hit those buttons. And so this is just a nice way of keeping it clean, where I'm always seeing the names of my tracks without seeing the buttons, unless I start to zoom in this case. So you'll notice now that the names have disappeared. I'm just going to go back and do that one more time. Customize. And I'm just going to grab this A1 and just place it in that top row right there and click OK. And now I get that name at the top. And so now when I use keyboard shortcuts to, zoom in and out on tracks, if I zoom all the way, or not zoom, sorry, if I minimize all the tracks, you can now see that I've got everything clearly labeled. Now, the other thing when you're preparing for like doing an audio turnover, you want to make sure that you keep the, you really want to try and organize things based on the role that the audio is playing. In other words, keep all the dialogue on dialogue tracks, keep the voiceover on a voiceover track, keep your music on music tracks, sound effects on sound effects tracks. So that's why it's important to kind of label things. If you do this, your sound mixer is going to love you. If you don't, and everything is kind of haphazardly scattered around, that's where you might get some feedback on that. Jason, you can probably talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, labeling is we used to joke about it all the time, like in Photoshop, where everything is layer numerical value, with thousands of layers. But with this stuff in particular, like you said, one, the fact that it's so easy to just inadvertently have dialogue on a track where maybe there was one bit of sound design, you thought, I don't want to waste another track. But you're really complicating the issue for the sound mixer, especially in a turnover situation. So keeping everything consistent and having everything labeled is just, it can be a drag at the start, but it pays off huge dividends in the end, especially if you have to turn it over to someone who's unfamiliar with your project structure and everything else.
Exactly. And you can make it easy on yourself as well by making a sequence preset. I'm not going to show that here today, but if you know how to make a new sequence preset, if you go to the Tracks tab, you can actually put those labels in ahead of time so that every time you start up and you make a new sequence and you start editing, you already have tracks labeled music, effects, dialogue, and so on. So there's some really nice shortcuts for just sort of getting in the habit of being a little bit more organized. Or the other thing is you hire a great assistant editor who does this cleanup work when it's time to do turnovers. And I've seen both cases in Hollywood. Some don't like to be, they like to be free and unfettered, I guess would be the right term. And a great assistant makes sure that the turnovers work appropriately. But
by the way, before you go further, I wanted to also tell you, last week on the masterclass, I did a whole thing about how to create presets all throughout the Premiere app. And I think the number one preset feature that got the most ooh, ah, and in particular, like the I didn't even know you could do that, was the track height preset. We're not going to do it now, but I just wanted to point out, if anyone wants to know, you can also create presets for like track height configurations just to make life easier on different size screens. And this is one of those slightly undiscovered features, but it's so awesome. And I got that directly from Karl. So thank you, dude. I just want to let you know that.
And I just actually used one of these presets. They are found in the wrench menu if you want to go tinker around with them. It's pretty intuitive, I think, once you get used to it, but it'll snapshot what the track heights are. And I have one here that I specifically use for looking for voiceover and just when I'm working with dialogue, I want to make sure that I can maximize those tracks and make sure that I get clean cuts at the ends and things, and put in ambient sound if I need to. The other thing you'll notice here is the label colors are something that we use quite a bit. And the label colors actually make it easy if you do have to do some last minute checks on a sequence before you turn it over to make sure everything is organized. If you use a label color for your dialogue, for your music, for your sound effects, and I also recommend, I'm going to talk about this in a second, if you have a mix of sound effects that you work with and some are mono and some are stereo, it's a good idea to label them different colors and actually put them in different tracks. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But using these label colors, one of the things that I've heard some people talk about, I'm going to go to my preferences here and go to labels. And this is the type of thing that an assistant can actually go in and change the names of these labels in here, and it will only affect that workstation. It's a personal preference. But one thing that I've seen a lot of assistants do, a lot of editors do, is instead of just using the name, like, here's the color for my dialogue, and the name is just simply green. You know what? I can actually come in here and call this dialogue. Go figure. So by doing that, it makes it easy if I'm trying to group things. If I have any question of what is what, where things should belong, there's actually a keyboard shortcut. If I right-click, it's also a right-click menu option. If I right-click on a clip here and go to Label, first off, you'll notice that this down doesn't just say green, and there's no chance of me mixing it up with what the difference is between forest and green. It says dialogue. It's what it is. This option at the top is often overlooked, but if I select this, I can immediately see all of my dialogue clips get highlighted. And if I have dialogue anywhere else, in fact, I do, there's a clip down here in SFX 15 that is some extra dialogue that I probably don't want to have there. I can quickly clean this up and move it where I need it to be so that, again, it doesn't frustrate the sound designer when they get this over in, applications like Pro Tools and other things that might be used on the sound stage or in other types of sound mixing programs.
So, hey, Karl, you brought this up a moment ago, and I don't know if you're going to go into this, but I did want to raise the issue because this is something that I know I get asked a lot with regard to organizing tracks and the handling of stereo versus mono versus multi-channel versus adaptive, all the different flavors that we have in Premiere. So I don't know if you're going to go into that a bit, but I know there is some confusion because of the way, for instance, as you just mentioned, Pro Tools. Now it's much more standardized now. Older versions were a little bit different, but where everything was kind of seen as dual channel mono, there really was no stereo, right? And these days it's a little different, but I don't know if you're going to go into that, but if you were, that would be awesome. Yeah.
A couple of things to note on this front. Premiere has this concept of something called a standard track. And standard tracks are the most flexible because you can drop stereo content and you'll see two waveforms, or mono content, you'll see a single full height waveform into the same track. And Premiere does what most people expect that to do. It makes the mono content sort of center pan, so you hear it out of both left and right speakers, and it will play back the individual tracks as if they were panned left and right for the stereo content. If you're planning on doing this for a turnover, I highly, highly recommend that you separate out the mono content onto separate tracks from the stereo content. And the reason for this is when you do the turnover, applications like Pro Tools, and I think it's a limit of the file format and the way we export to this standard turnover file format called an AAF file, Advanced Authoring Format is what that stands for. What that does is it will actually look at that, and it doesn't understand that you've got mono and stereo on a single track. So what it does is it creates 3 tracks: stereo left, stereo right, and mono. So you can have a situation where you have 10 tracks in your Premiere edit, and when the sound designer gets it, it suddenly is 30 tracks,
right,
and wondering like, what is this? What's going on? And sometimes it doesn't, when the file moves over, it doesn't always put them in the same order that they were before. So it's important to kind of make sure, again, you're wanting to make this as smooth of a process as possible, the least amount of cleanup. So if you have a situation, here I've got most of my dialogue here. This is actually somewhat separated out correctly. I've got, this is voiceover 1. This is a mono clip. You see this is a stereo clip. Yeah. So this is a situation where I might want to create a VO3 track and move this down and keep all my stereo voiceover over here on VO2 and 3, keep all my mono content on VO1.
And this is so common, exactly that scenario. I mean, I'm guilty of this myself because, maybe there's a piece of ADR, just some other take, which for whatever reason was captured or printed as stereo versus, single channel mono. So it's the same actor, same take, whatever, you throw it in the same track. But for this process, you really want to be mindful of that and be more careful and really separate and keep everything consistent across the track too. That's a huge, huge point.
Exactly. And, this is the type of thing that if the edit is still actively going on, oftentimes when a turnover is going to happen, if this is like a feature film, the audio turnover might actually happen 10, 15 times on some films. I think Deadpool was around 15. I think Only the Brave, I think it was closer to like 8 or 9, if memory serves. Sometimes I forget these things. So you might have to prep this. Usually what happens is, everybody says, okay, whatever state the edit is in on Thursday at 1 p.m., that's when we're going to do the turnover. And so that's when you start prepping the various files. You prep the reels. And in a lot of cases, what happens is you'll take and actually make a new sequence and copy and paste your current edit into that new sequence. And, some ways that you can kind of clean things up as well is you can actually have sort of a turnover template and create mono tracks for the content is mono. I might, in this situation, make my A1 track in my turnover sequence as a mono track. So that way mono content goes into the mono track. That's again, just helps to make sure everything is cleaned up and working appropriately. The other thing just to note, I just want to stress this since we're talking about turnovers. When it comes to the video files, if you're dealing with anything where you had second system audio, we talked about this before when I talked about dailies workflows. Very, very, very important to get clean turnovers. Don't use the merge clips function, use the multicam function at the get-go. The reason for this is many times when you do these turnovers, you're providing the WAV files from your edit. But in many cases, the sound designer might want to link back to the original source files. They want to link back to the original ISO recordings that maybe have more microphones in them that they want to kind of tinker around with and play around with. The only way to make sure that that's going to happen cleanly is the naming of the files here has to match. And there's an issue with the way the older function called merge clips works, that it doesn't include any of that audio information. There's no audio data included in that. So if you need to sync picture and sound and you are planning on a turnover workflow, highly, highly recommended you use multicam to do it. Multicam can do it in a batch. There's a lot of other benefits to doing it and how you can set up a multicam to sort of automate that dailies process. So again, this is one of those things about planning for it so that when we're now at this end stage, there's no extra gotchas that you have to run into. Once you've got everything prepped and ready to go, it's really as simple as just selecting the sequence, going to export. And for audio purposes, there's 2 main formats that we typically use. OMF is old. OMF is actually, by the company that created OMF, has actually marked it as a deprecated format, meaning it's an obsolete format. It's got some weird limitations in it. If you try and make an OMF file and it gets bigger than 2 gigs, it basically makes an invalid OMF file. The answer that we've gotten when it comes to developing OMF further is don't develop OMF any further, use AAF. So AAF is the successor. And anybody using modern forms of tools like Pro Tools are going to gladly accept an AMF or an AAF file. When you're in the AAF world, the first thing you'll notice, there's a message that came up really quickly. I'm going to show that just one more time here, just because I think it's important. One of the things that we do with AAF is the simplifying project message that comes up. We look for things and we flatten out. If you've got like audio has been nested because it started in a multicam or something like that, we actually extract it so that the metadata from the original source file is going to be passed across. And that's an important thing that just kind of happens in the background. The biggest thing here, to do AAF export, you do have to break things out to mono. So you will have mono tracks. The biggest options in here, there are 2 options in here for embedding the audio or separating out the audio. Embed means you're going to have one file is going to be exported. It's going to be this massively huge AAF file. But all of the audio, all the either WAV, AIFF, whatever the audio was on your timeline, is going to be embedded in that single file. So you can move that single file around, and it's pretty self-contained. It works. I think most people prefer to use this separate audio function because the separate audio function, it actually allows for linking to other files. And this is crucial if you've been cutting with like a boom mic, but on set they mic'd up every individual actor with lavs or hidden microphones or something along those lines. The sound mixer is going to want to have all those choices at their fingertips. Right. And the way to accomplish that is if you use separate audio, and there's this checkbox here called Preserve Media Directory Name. This is actually also very, very helpful because it'll make subfolders. It basically will create a folder. It'll put a small AAF file in there with just the metadata information and the cut, and then it'll list out all of the individual media files, but it'll also preserve the subfolders where those existed. And so what this means is it makes it very easy for the sound designer, if they want to just link back to the original multi-channel WAV files, and I've seen even on some TV shows, they may record an overall boom mic, but they have everything in the room is mic'd up. Right. And they want to be able to switch between those microphones. Checking this box using separate audio will make sure and enable that. Beyond this, the rest of this is fairly straightforward. AIFF or broadcast wave format. Do you want the complete audio files, or you just want trims of what was actually edited in the sequence with handles? Again, if you want to make this simple, if you know that the audio engineer is going to link back to the original source media, set this to trim audio files and maybe give some handles if necessary. You don't even need that really because they're going to link back to the original source media. But that's kind of the basics of handing it over the wall. What you're going to get back at that point is typically your entire timeline will be an entire mixed audio file. And the key thing there is usually you'll go back through and drop that into some bottom level tracks in your timeline, and that becomes the new audio that gets played back. You mute everything else. And then as you move forward, if there are changes to be had in the edit, you actually cut that mix track, delete it out, go back to your temp sound mix with all the different bits and pieces, and start to move things and change things around. And then again, at the end, you can then send that back and do another turnover and another turnover, and it becomes kind of a circular process. Now, the other thing to note, there are some houses that actually handle something called a change list. When we talk about doing a turnover, the AAF file is just one of the files that you're typically going to deliver to that audio house. Usually what you also need to do is render your timeline, deliver what is called a chase file. In other words, you need a copy, the editor needs a copy of the picture. They need a copy of what you did as a temporary sound designer. They want to get your intent. They want to be able to go back to that and listen to it. And so it's important to provide that. Now, the last thing that you also have to consider delivering are either XML files or some sort of a change list. Now, Premiere Pro doesn't typically deliver change lists. We don't have a change list function built into it. And a lot of people ask us this question, like, why don't you have a change list function? Well, the problem is there is no engineering spec or standard for doing change lists. Change lists used to be a written out, handwritten note when you were cutting film to say, lift this section, move it to this different time code value. So because of this, what's happened in the industry, there's really two standards that we've kind of seen. There's a number of tools out there that can take an XML of your current edit and an XML of a previous edit and compare the two and build out a list of what the changes are, what's different between those. The two main varieties I see, there's a utility out there that is used by some of the houses like Skywalker. In fact, I believe it was an engineer at Skywalker Sound that actually wrote it. And that delivers for what they need. There's some other tools that are out there. In fact, there's one that I have on my system that's it's called Changeless CC. And this is a little utility from a company called Intelligent Assistance in Burbank. And the idea behind this is this actually lets you take two different XML files. Oh, there's a new version available. Well, let's skip that for now. So this actually allows you to open up two XML files of your sequence. So if you're doing your second turnover, the first time you give a turnover to a sound mixer, they don't need a change list. Obviously, it's the first time they're getting the files. But now when you're on that second run, they kind of want to know, well, what did you change in the edit? What is different this time around? So this is where you can give them a copy of the XML from the first edit and then a copy of the XML from the second edit, run it through this utility program. What this actually delivers is more of a what I would call an Avid style change list, which is really just a text document with very, very specific spacing between this column and this column and this column and this column. And it tries to go through and provide a very specific syntax, very specific way of wording how to change things. There's, just like in math, there's many different ways to describe how an edit has changed. If I drag this sound effect and I trim off, 15 frames off of the sound effect, you could describe that as trimming 15 frames. You could also describe it as removing the clip, bringing the clip back in 15 frames shorter. And that's why it's important that that syntax does what it's supposed to do. So there's a number of utilities out there. If you look for change lists, you'll find that there's a number of different ones out there. And that's also typically something that you would deliver. Really quick, I'm not going to spend too much time on color, but I just wanted to point out color turnovers are something similar. That's usually something that's done more at the end. And how this is handled really depends on whether you did all of the temp color work inside of Premiere or whether you're editing footage that somebody else already added some color effects to. As you know, most of the cameras today, the original camera footage looks washed out and milky because it's in that log space, protecting the highlights, protecting the shadows. So most people don't like to edit with that. They always like to have some kind of color either burned into the editing media. It's not uncommon to take your footage from your camera and run off a series of ProRes files that you're actually going to edit with. So it's a common thing to add some color at that stage, put some LUTs and things on the clips. So if you're working in that environment, really it's a matter of tracking what LUTs were put on in the first place so that you can pass those over to the colorist at the end of the day. They kind of know what your starting point was, what LUTs were used. And it's not uncommon to have 2 LUTs on every piece of footage. You have sort of that translation LUT or input LUT, which is what's found in the basic correction section of Lumetri. And then you have a creative LUT or a scene LUT. And this basically could be like, you might have different ones for indoors versus outdoors, for example. So in this situation, the 2 main workflows that we see, some people do this work using Lumetri on every clip. They can actually have kind of a non-destructive color workflow in Premiere, so that they may be working with the original red footage and just putting these different LUTs on to kind of achieve a look that is based on what the cinematographer wanted. There's one additional set of values as well, something called CDL values that exist outside of Lumetri, but there's a special effect, you can look it up in the effects, called CDL. And that has these special number values that kind of paint red, green, and blue a little bit differently. And those are values that actually go on certain cameras. So anyway, you have this information. It might be live in Lumetri. It might be already baked into your editing files, in which case you're thinking, well, what do I have to deal with it if I'm not doing color at all in Premiere? You might still want to just make sure that the metadata is there. What I mean by that, I'm going to go ahead and go back to my editing workspace here. And in my editing workspace, let me take my project here, and I'm just going to blow this up full screen. You might want to make sure that you have metadata information in certain columns in this. And if you don't see those columns, you may have to add those columns by going to the metadata display window, going to the Premiere project metadata. And these columns in particular, what these are called, there's a few that are called ASC values. You want to make sure and turn those on. And the other values are called LUT, LUT1, and LUT2. Now, the project that I have right now has these are actually blank. If I had CDL values applied to my footage, if that was something that the person making my footage at the beginning of the edit that's converting the camera footage into ProRes or something, if they baked in some color values, I might have metadata that actually shows up in these different columns. I might have the names of whatever LUTs they used, and typically the first column would be that translation LUT to put it in more of a Rec 709 space. And then the next column, LUT2, would be that show LUT. That might be something that the cinematographer put together and called it indoors or outdoors or different environments, in the matrix, outside the matrix, that type of thing, the creative aspect of color.
And Karl, you just reminded me, this was actually the one panel I forgot to showcase in my making presets, which is because what's really important about what you just did there is that, right, you don't necessarily always need to see those values. Obviously, this takes up a lot of screen real estate. So we also allow you to save those metadata presets as different ways to view that content, and it gets saved. That state will get saved with the project as well. So that's super useful.
Exactly. So these columns may already be filled in. In fact, that's something that's worth checking before you turn over to color. When you first start getting those files from whoever, the digital imaging technician, the DIT, is going through and making this editing media for you. Make sure that they're including whatever CDL values were baked in. Make sure that the LUT names were actually listed here. You're not going to apply these LUTs. They're not something that you're going to have inside of Premiere, but this is just making sure that the colorist has the right information. So when you turn over the edit, you don't get a frantic phone call going, do you know what LUT they used when they made your editing media? It's going to be in the file. The other thing, if you are using Premiere to do this, oops, let me go back to here. What you would want to make sure and do, if you're using LUTs, put the LUT that you're using in the basic correction, this input LUT here, put that in the first column called LUT. And then in creative, put the creative LUT that you're using in the LUT2 column. And by doing that, you're basically the look that you're getting, you're passing that information across. And you can do that in batch. You can actually select a bunch of clips, open up the metadata panel, and just copy and paste a LUT name in there, and it'll copy across that whole range of clips. So it's not that difficult if you don't have it. If you've actually kind of generated these, especially like your creative look, you've done it using Lumetri, always know that you can actually save that out as a .look or a .cube file, and that's something you can include with your edit to just say, hey, we did some color work. The director wanted to kind of match some shots, and we did some color work in Premiere. So this is actually the look that we have. You can actually hand that LUT file over to the colorist. They may use it, they may not. Sometimes it's a good way of just sort of showing them, the intent of what you're trying to do. Now, the last thing that I want to show is just exporting out for color. And this is something where you typically are going to have to sort of flatten your timeline down a bit. The format used for a lot of the color turnovers, some places can use an XML file, in which case you don't necessarily have to flatten things down. But in some cases, if you're using an EDL, an edit decision list, you need to kind of flatten the timeline down so that you get sort of this single track of your cut, so that whatever I'm seeing here, each of these clips is just living in this video 4 timeline. Once I do that, I can go to export EDL. And if you haven't been in here in a while, we've added a bunch of checkboxes over the years. This isn't one of those marquee things that ends up in our marketing information, but we've been working. Yeah. So the important thing here is to choose which track you're going to export in your EDL. The one you'll notice here is there's a checkbox here for color. It actually says include ASC CDL values and LUTs. And so that specifically is going to take those columns of metadata that I showed you in the project bin, and it's going to export those values in a way that other tools out there, like Baselight, for example, can actually read that information in the CDL file and provide that as part of a report, provide that as something moving forward. So a couple of other checkboxes. This one here for longer file names is a very common one. The rest of these, this is something else about turnover workflows that I want to stress. It doesn't matter what set of tools that you're using, what you're using to edit with. It's always, 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 if this is a new relationship with a new finishing or post house that you're working with, to do some tests. As soon as you get the actual editing media in, it's usually a good idea to just take a day. Once you've got maybe a scene edited together, put it through your pipeline. Send over something to the audio house and just say, hey, here's a quick temp sound mix that we put together. I just want to make sure everything's coming through good on your end. It's the same way that Jason and I do a live broadcast. We don't flip a switch and just immediately go live. There's that sort of, pre-broadcast section where we test everything out. You got to do that in a turnover workflow because there's so many different tools out there. There's one case in particular. This was a broadcast, network broadcast scripted drama that we were working on, where we went to do the audio turnover, and every clip in their copy of Pro Tools was coming in with the same file name. And we very quickly realized that this was, it was just a known issue that already had a fix for it in the latest copy of their software. And so it required an update on their end. And, we found this out, during the testing process, and we're able to figure out a workaround for it. So it's always important to make sure that you test out the pipeline, particularly if it's a new finishing house that you're working with for the first time, to make sure that everything goes smoothly.
Yeah, and you don't want to do this thing at the 11th hour. And that's, that's just like great. It seems like it's obvious advice, but right, at some point, it doesn't even have to be when everything is done. Create an ADL and do a test run with whomever you're gonna hand this off to, because it's just gonna save you so much time and frustration. I mean, imagine if it were 11th hour, you're sending that Pro Tools engineer the export, and now you're troubleshooting on the clock. I mean, that's you never want to do. You don't want to do that. Been there, but you don't want to do that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. The only other thing that I'll also just point out as a feature that has come across, if you've got a large project, this is less and less of an issue now with productions because we can have smaller projects within the overall production. But there is actually a function in Premiere that we used to see used fairly frequently. And the idea behind this was to select a sequence and go File, Export, Selection as Premiere Pro project. So if you're working on turnovers and you've got a fairly complex project and you want to make sure that your XML translates across correctly, you want to make sure everything is selected properly. Sometimes when it's time to do these turnovers, it's actually not a bad idea to move away from the production and move into sort of a separate standalone project for a bit, just to make sure that you've got all your bells and whistles set up. And this also kind of goes to the idea when you do an export for an XML file, make sure you have the sequence selected. Don't try and make an XML file when you have nothing selected, because Premiere will try and take that entire project and encapsulate it into a single XML file. And that's typically not what a lot of these finishing applications want. Usually when I find people are having trouble with XML, that's one of the biggest little gotchas, is there's two ways of exporting that XML. With a sequence selected, you just get that one sequence, or with nothing selected in your project bin, in which case you get the entire project in an XML format. So that's all the wisdom I've got for today, Jason. I hope this was informative for everybody. I do get a lot of questions on this. This is something that we do a lot. Our team does a lot of just kind of talking people through this process, helping people through the pipeline, making sure that the pipeline is, it's clean and easy. And the thing I always like to stress to people is it can be a very simple and easy process to do turnovers, particularly if you plan for it. The times where I hear from people that say, oh, you can't do a proper turnover from Premiere, it's like, well, there's so many people that use Premiere on different skill levels, and right. If you've been delivering for YouTube and you think, well, what worked for YouTube is going to work for going to Technicolor,
right? Right.
It's
not exactly.
Not exactly, yeah, and that's where you have to have this forethought and knowledge, and we're just hoping to get that out there. We've actually got a document that covers a lot of this that the film team is working on. You've seen the parts of this with some of the documentation on productions, but we've got additional pieces on dailies workflows, turnover workflows. These are things that are they're in the pipe. We're getting them finalized now, so we'll be pushing those out via social channels here shortly.
That's so awesome, dude. So just one question here, and I'm not exactly sure, from Camilo over on YouTube is asking. Now they're asking about, is it better to export in EDL or XML? So do you have the same, if you were to can you do a color handoff via XML as well?
Yeah.
You can, but there's not as much data in that XML, right?
Well,
or different data.
It's different. It's different in how it organizes it. What I always say is, in a lot of cases, if you're working on a particular feature film, as you're talking to the various houses, there's usually kind of a discussion, and it's sort of like picking a protocol or picking a codec. Right. There's a lot of personal preferences on what to do, what workflows that, in a lot of cases, people have these scripted workflows that, they've written these custom little scripts that can take a file and expand it out or import it in a different way and things like that. So every post house is a little bit different. XML is fine for color. A lot of people going to Resolve, for example, if that's the tool that you want to do your finishing in, that works just fine. It really just depends on talking to people. And the only time I recommend pushing back a little bit is if somebody says, oh yeah, we always use OMF, send me an OMF file. I would always kind of say, well, is an AAF okay?
Right. Yeah.
Just because of the issues that I mentioned. If they say no, absolutely, we have to have an OMF file, you can still export an OMF. Premiere still does it. Just know that most of our development work is happening with AAF moving forward. And even when we've asked the Pro Tools team, hey, we want to make some changes to OMF, they're like, don't change OMF. Don't work on OMF, work on AAF. So, it is a deprecated format, and people kind of have to move forward on that. But That's the one area that I always see. It's usually kind of having a discussion a little bit and saying, if you're doing VFX turnovers is another area we didn't get the chance to cover today.
Right.
But EDLs are kind of key for that, and we added some checkboxes in there that include clip markers, so that if you're giving somebody clips with handles, but you want to be able to mark this is the actual shot being used in the film, and then there's a handle on either end, you can provide that all in one timeline. You can say, here are all the VFX shots, and there's actually an editor, and I'm going to be doing an interview with John Carr, who is the VFX editor on Terminator, in a couple weeks for the Motion Picture Editors Guild. But we, part of that is putting all the VFX out on a single sequence with handles marked out, and EDL works great for that. So, it's just an important part of the process. We want to make sure that, while Creative Cloud provides all the tools for one person to do a little bit of everything, that doesn't preclude making sure that, if you're doing your editing in Premiere and you want to do your finishing elsewhere, that you can do that. And that's what this is all about.
Awesome. Also, just as a side note, if people do have to work with OMF and really they don't ever need to touch the video side of things, Audition is phenomenal at, one, importing, but also exporting a very clean, very standard, works wonderfully in Pro Tools, bulletproof OMF.
Yeah.
So,
and in that situation, you might actually use, there's a menu command. If you right click on a sequence in the bin, you can choose to edit that in Audition. And it's a near perfect, it's pretty close to full fidelity. I think there's a few things that don't translate, but for the most part, you get all your keyframes, you get all of your effects, all translate over into Audition. So it's a pretty seamless process getting a sequence from Premiere into Audition. And then if you export the OMF from there, you might actually have some better results, because I know that they've continued, just because it is a format that it just has a lot of legacy use out there. They've continued to provide additional options for that.
Yes. Awesome. All right, Karl. Well, hey, once again, thank you so much for this really, really eye-opening and extremely useful series that we're continuing to do here. This is the kind of stuff which, just like the track height presets, which, by the way, you didn't see, there were quite a couple thumbs ups in the various chats. Like, yes, that was my favorite part of my preset masterclass. So thanks again for that. But this is so valuable, and like you said, a lot of times, even if you've been using Premiere for a long time, there's these little things that get added over time that we just don't always trumpet. And if you haven't gone to something like an EDL export because you thought it was maybe inferior or missing something before, it's always worth revisiting, because we're constantly updating these things, and a lot of times it's done sort of in the background, which is another great reason, if people haven't already checked it out, to start maybe looking into using some of the video and audio betas, which are available to all Creative Cloud members. So from within the Creative Cloud desktop application, you will notice, if you open it up and you see your list of apps and everything else, there's a little beaker icon that says beta apps. You don't have to sign up, you don't have to do anything. Today, right now, this moment, you will have access to beta versions of all of the video and audio apps specifically. Now, again, if you're part of another Adobe pre-release beta program, they'll show up there too. This, though, is for everybody. There's no sign-up required. And we just released a couple of new features in beta across Premiere, Rush, and After Effects, including the scene edit detection feature that we showed a week ago during our June 16th launch update, as well as the new RotoBrush 2 feature in After Effects. You can test that out right now in beta, as well as auto reframe in Premiere Rush. And the cool thing is, inside those apps, there's another beaker icon where you can see what's done, what's been added, what's been worked on. And again, it's a lot of these little things like, oh, we added 2 new checkboxes in EDL. It's not something we're going to do a whole blog post on, but that's one of those areas where you can find some of those little hidden gems that you've provided so many of us with. So as always, man, thank you.
So many of them. And it's amazing to me. I'll show something like, holding shift to move a clip up and down and constrain it from moving left and right. And the room erupts. Whereas, here's something, incredible powered by Sensei. And, it's kind of like, yeah, that's cool too.
That's cool. Right. Yeah. I was going to say one of those for me, the snap and program monitor, right? So we added guides and everything else.
Oh yeah.
But there's the keyboard shortcut and then the menu command to just snap objects and text in the program monitor when you're doing graphics. It's huge, right? I mean, equivalent to the shift command of constraining movement. So small, but so useful and something that people encounter every day. So those are really where it's at. Anyway, everyone, thank you so much again for watching. Thank you for being patient and sticking with us with our little momentary technical glitch at the top of the hour here. So until next time, have a great morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world, and we will see you again on the next broadcast. And if you're around tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time, I will be doing another masterclass on behance.net/Adobe Live. So until then, have a good one, everybody. Thank you, Karl, and thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.